Section 14, Part 1, Chapter 3, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He had accustomed himself to believe that he would never return to it. During the first years of his life in America, the trip would have been an impossibility because of the military service which he had evaded. Then he had vague news of different amnesties. After the time for conscription had long since passed, an inertness of will had made him consider a return to his country as somewhat absurd and useless. On the other side, nothing remained to attract him. He had even lost track of those country relatives with whom his mother had lived. In his heaviest hours he had tried to occupy his activity by planning an enormous mausoleum, all of marble, in La Recoleta, the cemetery of the rich, in order to move thither the remains of Madariaga as founder of the dynasty, following him with all his own when their hour should come. He was beginning to feel the weight of age. He was nearly 70 years old, and the rude life of the country, the horseback rides in the rain, the rivers forded upon his swimming horse, the nights passed in the open air, had brought on a rheumatism that was torturing his best days. His family, however, reawakened his enthusiasm. To Paris! He began to fancy that he was 20 again, and forgetting his habitual parsimony, wished his household to travel like royalty in the most luxurious staterooms, and with personal servants. Two copper-hued country girls, born on the ranch and elevated to the rank of maids to the senora and her daughter, accompanied them on the voyage, their oblique eyes betraying not the slightest astonishment before the greatest novelties. Once in Paris, Desnoyers found himself quite bewildered. He confused the names of streets, proposed visits to buildings which had long since disappeared, and all his attempts to prove himself an expert authority on Paris were attended with disappointment. His children, guided by recent reading up, knew Paris better than he. He was considered a foreigner in his own country. At first he even felt a certain strangeness in using his native tongue, for he had remained on the ranch without speaking a word of his language for years at a time. He was used to thinking in Spanish, and translating his ideas into the speech of his ancestors, spattered his French with all kinds of Creole dialect. "Where a man makes his fortune and raises his family, there is his true country," he said sententiously, remembering Madariaga. The image of that distant country dominated him with insistent obsession as soon as the impressions of the voyage had worn off. He had no French friends, and upon going into the street, his feet instinctively took him to the places where the Argentinians gathered together. It was the same with them. They had left their country only to feel with increasing intensity the desire to talk about it all the time. There he read the papers, commenting on the rising prices in the fields, on the prospects for the next harvests, and on the sales of cattle. Returning home, his thoughts were still in America, and he chuckled with delight as he recalled the way in which the two Chinas had defied the professional dignity of the French cook, preparing their native stews and other dishes in Creole style. He had settled the family in an ostentatious house in the Avenida Victor Hugo, for which he paid a rental of 28,000 francs. Dona Luisa had to go and come many times before she could accustom herself to the imposing aspect of the concierges. He, decorated with gold trimmings on his black uniform and wearing white whiskers like a notary in a comedy, she with a chain of gold upon her exuberant bosom, and receiving the tenants in a red and gold salon. In the rooms above was ultra-modern luxury, gilded and glacial, with white walls and glass doors with tiny panes, which exasperated Desnoyers, who longed for the complicated carvings and rich furniture in vogue during his youth. He himself directed the arrangements and furnishings of the various rooms, which always seemed empty. Chichi protested against her father's avarice when she saw him buying slowly and with much calculation and hesitation. "Avarice, no," he retorted. "It is because I know the worth of things." Nothing pleased him that he had not acquired at 1/3 of its value. Beating down those who overcharged but proved the superiority of the buyer, Paris offered him one delightful spot which he could not find anywhere else in the world: the Hotel Drouot. He would go there every afternoon that he did not find other important auctions advertised in the papers. For many years there was no famous failure in Parisian life, with its consequent liquidation, from which he did not carry something away. The use and need of these prizes were matters of secondary interest. The great thing was to get them for ridiculous prices. So the trophies from the auction rooms now began to inundate the apartment which at the beginning he had been furnishing with such desperate slowness. His daughter now complained that the home was getting overcrowded. The furnishings and ornaments were handsome, but too many, far too many. The white walls seemed to scowl at the magnificent sets of chairs and the overflowing glass cabinets. Rich and velvety carpets, over which had passed many generations, covered all the compartments. Showy curtains, not finding a vacant frame in the salons, adorned the doors leading into the kitchen. The wall moldings gradually disappeared under an overlay of pictures, placed close together like the scales of a cuirass. Who now could accuse Desnoyers of avarice? He was investing far more than a fashionable contractor would have dreamed of spending. The underlying idea still was to acquire all this for 1/4 of its price, an exciting bait which lured the economical man into continuous dissipation. He could sleep well only when he had driven a good bargain during the day. He bought at auction thousands of bottles of wine consigned by bankrupt firms, and he who scarcely ever drank packed his wine cellars to overflowing, advising his family to use the champagne as freely as ordinary wine. The failure of a furrier induced him to buy for 14,000 francs pelts worth 90,000. In consequence, the entire Desnoyers family seemed suddenly to be suffering as frightfully from cold as though a polar iceberg had invaded the Avenida Victor Hugo. The father kept only one fur coat for himself, but ordered 3 for his son. Chichi and Dona Luisa appeared arrayed in all kinds of silky and luxurious skins. One day chinchilla, other days blue fox, marten, or seal. The enraptured buyer would permit no one but himself to adorn the walls with his new acquisitions, using the hammer from the top of a step ladder in order to save the expense of a professional picture hanger. He wished to set his children the example of economy. In his idle hours, he would change the position of the heaviest pieces of furniture, trying every kind of combination. This employment reminded him of those happy days when he handled great sacks of wheat and bundles of hides on the ranch. Whenever his son noticed that he was looking thoughtfully at a monumental sideboard or heavy piece, he prudently betook himself to other haunts. Desnoyers stood a little in awe of the 2 housemen, very solemn, correct creatures, always in dress suit, who could not hide their astonishment at seeing a man with an income of more than 1,000,000 francs engaged in such work. Finally, it was the 2 coppery maids who aided their patron, the 3 working contentedly together like companions in exile. 4 automobiles completed the luxuriousness of the family. The children would have been more content with one, small and dashing in the very latest style. But Desnoyers was not the man to let a bargain slip past him, so one after the other he had picked up the 4, tempted by the price. They were as enormous and majestic as coaches of state. Their entrance into a street made the passers-by turn and stare. The chauffeur needed 2 assistants to help him keep his flock of mastodons in order, but the proud owner thought only of the skill with which he had gotten the best of the salesmen, anxious to get such monuments out of their sight. To his children he was always recommending simplicity and economy. "We are not as rich as you suppose. We own a good deal of property, but it produces a scanty income." And then, after refusing a domestic expenditure of 200 francs, he would put 5,000 into an unnecessary purchase just because it would mean a great loss to the seller. Julio and his sister kept protesting to their mother, Dona Luisa, Chichi even going so far as to announce that she would never marry a man like her father. "Hush, hush!" exclaimed the scandalized Creole. "He has his little peculiarities, but he is very good. Never has he given me any cause for complaint. I only hope that you may be lucky enough to find his equal." Her husband's quarrelsomeness, his irritable character, and his masterful will all sank into insignificance when she thought of his unvarying fidelity. In so many years of married life, nothing. His faithfulness had been unexceptional even in the country where many, surrounded by beasts and intent on increasing their flocks, had seemed to become contaminated by the general animalism. She remembered her father only too well. Even her sister was obliged to live in apparent calmness with the vainglorious Karl, quite capable of disloyalty, not because of any special lust, but just to imitate the doings of his superiors. Desnoyers and his wife were plodding through life in a routine affection, reminding Dona Luisa, in her limited imagination, of the yokes of oxen on the ranch who refused to budge whenever another animal was substituted for the regular companion. Her husband certainly was quick-tempered, holding her responsible for all the whims with which he exasperated his children, yet he could never bear to have her out of his sight. The afternoons at the Hotel Drouot would be most insipid for him unless she was at his side, the confidante of his plans and wrathful outbursts. "Today there's to be a sale of jewels. Shall we go?" He would make this proposition in such a gentle and coaxing voice, the voice that Dona Luisa remembered in their first talks around the old home. And so they would go together, but by different routes. She in one of the monumental vehicles because, accustomed to the leisurely carriage rides of the ranch, she no longer cared to walk, and Desnoyers, although owner of the 4 automobiles, heartily abominating them because he was conservative and uneasy with the complications of new machinery, on foot, under the pretext that through lack of work his body needed exercise. When they met in the crowded salesrooms, they proceeded to examine the jewels together, fixing beforehand the price they would offer. But he, quick to become exasperated by opposition, always went further, hurling numbers at his competitors as though they were blows. After such excursions, the senora would appear as majestic and dazzling as a basilica of Byzantium, ears and neck decorated with great pearls, her bosom a constellation of brilliants, her hands radiating points of light of all colors of the rainbow. "Too much, mama," Chichi would protest. "They will take you for a pawnbroker's lady." But the Creole, satisfied with her splendor, the crowning glory of a humble life, attributed her daughter's fault-finding to envy. Chichi was only a girl now, but later on she would thank her for having collected all these gems for her. Already the home was unable to accommodate so many purchases. In the cellars were piled up enough paintings, furniture, statues, and draperies to equip several other dwellings. Don Marcelo began to complain of the cramped space in an apartment costing 28,000 francs a year, in reality large enough for a family 4 times the size of his. He was beginning to deplore being obliged to renounce some very tempting furniture bargains when a real estate agent smelled out the foreigner and relieved him of his embarrassment. "Why not buy a castle?" The entire family was delighted with the idea. A historic castle, the most historic that could be found, would supplement their luxurious establishment. Chichi paled with pride. Some of her friends had castles, others of old colonial family, who were accustomed to look down upon her for her country bringing up, would now cry with envy upon learning of this acquisition, which was almost a patent of nobility. The mother smiled in the hope of months in the country, which would recall the simple and happy life of her youth. Julio was less enthusiastic. The old man would expect him to spend much time away from Paris, but he consoled himself by reflecting that the suburban place would provide excuse for frequent automobile trips. Desnoyers thought of the relatives in Berlin. Why should he not have his castle like the others? The bargains were alluring. Historic mansions by the dozens were offered him. Their owners, exhausted by the expense of maintaining them, were more than anxious to sell. So he bought the castle of Villeblanche-sur-Marne, built in the time of the religious wars, a mixture of palace and fortress, with an Italian Renaissance facade, gloomy towers with pointed hoods, and moats in which swans were swimming. End of section 14. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico.